Hey family, welcome to the Recalibrate podcast. It's your host Esther Glory, and this is a new episode. Hi guys, and welcome to the podcast. I know we've had a few sober episodes back to back, but growth requires that. Growth requires a level of sitting back, looking, introspection, retrospection. Like we need to do all of the work. All of the work, okay? And so thank you guys for joining me in season 2. It's been a lot of longer episodes and it's been a bit more of a journey with you guys. And I'm enjoying hearing how the podcast is impacting each and every single one of you. So I appreciate all of you who have listened in from all over the world. I'm so grateful to each and every single listener. So let's dive right into this episode. Before we go anywhere, please make sure that you're following us on Instagram. My personal page is at GloryO_ and at the Recalibrate podcast to join our community Instagram. You can feel free to email at recalibrateuk@gmail.com. And please join our community, our online community and our Facebook group from recalibrateuk.com/community. And as you know, our last masterclass was on planning a holistic year, planning not just from goal to goal, but also to transform and conform into the image of Jesus Christ. And if you missed that masterclass and you would like to get the full experience, it's available on our website now for £6.99, and you can go and buy it at recalibrateuk.com/resources. recalibrateuk.com/resources. It's all available right there, right now. So go ahead and have a look and get it for yourself. Let's dive into this week's episode. So this week's episode is titled Grow, Fault versus Responsibility. Now, this is going to be an episode where we're going to do some real soul searching. And so I'm going to give you the random musing of my heart first and foremost. The random musing of my heart for this week's episode is a skill that I'm trying to adopt, and it's something that I'm trying to learn, and I'll share how with you. So this week, this last week since our last podcast episode, I've really been thinking about how I can adopt healthy levels of discomfort so that I can keep myself on this journey of growth. And I was realizing that when people want to grow and they want to keep the motivation to grow, even when the motivation isn't present, how do you keep that momentum? I was asking myself this question last week, and one of the things that came to me was that there has to be a level of uncomfortability or discomfort so that I can feel a need to move. And I was asking myself this question: what if everything that's been shaken and stirred around you is just to get you to move position? What if you're still not challenging yourself, stretching yourself, and shaking into the right position, or conforming or transforming into the right image or position or even posture because you're too comfortable? And while I was thinking about that, I thought about the fact that to keep the discipline of growth, even when motivation isn't available, I have to make sure that there are healthy levels of discomfort on this journey. So is it giving myself over to somebody else and being able to say, I want you to keep me accountable in this area, and I want you to challenge me once every month to do something in this area that's outside of my comfort zone? But healthy levels of discomfort allow you to move often, and you're able to handle change at such a greater capacity when you allow yourself to be uncomfortable in certain scenarios and or situations. One of the things that I don't allow myself to do, or I strive to not allow myself to do, is to become so comfortable that I am in love with the environment more than I am with my growth. And one of the things that can happen, especially in terms of success, is that the moment that you hit a place of success, you can begin to plateau when you become so comfortable in that environment and you learn how to function, how to navigate, and you're at the top of your game in that environment. I need to be in the room or in an environment or in a space where I can learn and grow. I must always have more. I must always be able to see more. And so the random musing of my heart for this week's episode is: don't get so comfortable with your environment that you fall out of love with your growth. And so get uncomfortable is what is my random musing to you this week. Get uncomfortable. And that's something that I'm adopting in various different ways, through accountability with community, through setting myself goals and targets that I know may be uncomfortable for me to do, that require me to do the work. to partner with God, to pray, the things that force you into prayer. Even though I may pray out of my love for God, there are some things that, because of how great the picture and the vision is, will force me into prayer, because I know that's the only place I'll be able to get my strength to grow. And those are disciplines that will help you to grow in God. And so, yeah, my random musing to you for this week is get uncomfortable. So let's dive into this episode. Why is it titled Fault versus Responsibility? So I'm going to speak to you about a time where I believe something was my fault and I allowed it to govern my growth. I'm going to speak to you about an example of where I saw something as my responsibility and I allowed that to govern my growth. And then I'm also going to speak to you about the differences and what came to me, or what I was able to recognize from both of these separate scenarios, and the principles that you can use to navigate your growth by realizing what is your fault and what is your responsibility. So yeah, let's dive right in. I'm not going to waste any more of your time. And so yeah, I'm just speaking about fault versus responsibility because this week I was thinking about the fact that in different areas in our lives, when it comes to traumas, when it comes to experiences, especially negative experiences, sometimes we can view these things as our fault. And when we view it as our fault, sometimes that can keep us in performance-based mindset so that we don't fail again. Sometimes we can keep ourselves in fear, and so we don't actually move. And then also, it also causes us to sometimes just be stagnant, or to avoid, to constantly to be avoidant of that situation happening again. And those things can actually stagnate your growth and stop you from growing. Because they don't allow you to see things from the right lens or perspective so that you can move forward. Now, I'm talking spiritually, emotionally, mentally, financially, physically, in every way, shape, form, and possible. Things can either be your fault or your responsibility, and how you determine it. And as we spoke about in season 1, you need to diagnose your lens for living. And so you must diagnose what you're looking at and how you're looking at it so that you know how to navigate and to move forward in each and every single scenario. And so scenario number 1. So this was something that I viewed as my fault. So I think I spoke about it in the imposter syndrome episode as well, but I'll just repeat it here. If this is your first episode, then also welcome. But yeah, I'll repeat it here. So there were some times where what I could give, or my activity, was more important than my identity. It wasn't, that's not the truth. But to me at the time, my perspective was guided, guarded, and built upon the basis or the idea that my activity was more important than my identity, and my activity informed my identity. So for the longest time, I remember first meeting people and they would ask me, "How are you?" And I would say, "I'm good." And they'll be like, "No, for real." And I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm good." I was not good at all. But I remember just saying, "I'm good," because "how are you" was a pleasantry to me. It wasn't a question that required vulnerability to answer. So as you can see, as we're getting towards the end of this season, I'm marrying all of the topics that we've gone through. So I'm speaking about imposter syndrome. I'm speaking about the vulnerability episode. And so just make sure that you backtrack and have a listen to some of the other episodes if you haven't caught up. But when people would ask me, "How are you?" it was a pleasantry to me. It didn't require vulnerability because people didn't care anyway, was the mindset that I had. I had this mindset that people didn't care to hear the answer. I remember phone conversations where people would call me and tell me anything and everything that was on their mind, and I would listen wholeheartedly. I would make myself available. I would listen. I would ask them, "Do you want a listening ear, or would you like advice?" Like I was there listening. Agony Aunt Glory. And then they would ask me, "How are you?" And I would go to respond with the same depth of vulnerability that they've just shared with me. And it would be like I would get half, if that, of their attention. They would be answering messages, responding to other people's emergencies, but yet not focused on what I was telling them. Sometimes I would give these SOS messages, kind of like saying like, yeah, I'm not doing great. And it's like, oh, why? And it's like, oh, just do A, B, C, and D and you'll be fine. But the same level of compassion or empathy that they were showing other people, I wasn't getting, even though I just sat and listened to over an hour of what was going on with them. And so at some point, I I I began to feel guilty, that I had set myself up in such a way where I was friends to other people, I was a listening ear to other people, I was a respondent to other people, but I didn't have that. And I felt guilty. I felt like it was my fault that I had set my life up in that way because I hadn't yet dealt with the fact that my activity and how my performance for other people, was more important than my identity. So people had gotten comfortable. So I believed people had gotten comfortable, with me just being fine and being strong and fixing it on my own, but being able to be there for them no matter what, and not having that in the reverse because I didn't expect it and I also didn't require it as a need for relationship with people. I had highly emotionally intelligent people who couldn't be emotionally intelligent with me because I had educated them in the wrong way about what I desired out of relationships. And so I felt guilty for a long time. It that thing had me bound. Let me not lie to you. That thing had me real bound because I was angry at myself. And I felt that the injustice towards myself was that I had set my relationships up in a way where my expectations and my needs were not important, were not asked for, were not given, and also weren't, what's the word that I'm looking for? And also weren't important. So basically, and that equated to me believing that I also wasn't important. And so I had to deal with the guilt that I felt and not allow that to become condemnation to the point where instead of uh distributing my anger to the right things. So instead of distributing my anger to people who had chosen not to be safe places for me, um, instead of me to distribute my anger to past experiences that I believed set me up for this, instead of me to distribute my anger or direct my anger even to the mindsets that I had had that had kept me bound or in the wrong position in relationships, I didn't do the active work. I just felt that it was my fault and this was my punishment. So a lack of good relationships was my punishment. Lazy friendships, abusive friendships were my punishment for not knowing how to do any better than to have performance-based relationships. Now that was something that I felt was my fault. And that thing had me bound for years. I didn't know how to be committed in relationships, in friendships. I didn't believe in long-term friendships. I believed in passive friendships where you would speak every day for maybe a year and then not speak for 3 years and come back and that would be okay. I settled for less in all of my relationships, all of them that I can name and or think of. I settled for less because I felt like it was my fault. Now that hindered me, that stopped me from wanting, that aided my laziness in becoming more vulnerable in my relationships. That aided my laziness in not wanting to open up. That aided my laziness in not wanting to get the ball rolling in terms of romantic relationships, friendships. That aided my lack of commitment to anything and everything. I could be compliant but not be committed. And me viewing these things as my fault allowed me to stay in that stagnancy. And so, one of the things that I'm going to speak about in our next point, which is responsibility, is when I began to view certain things as my responsibility, then I saw things through a different lens. And those things challenged me. These things brought in a healthy level of discomfort that challenged me, challenged my mindsets, challenged my capacity, challenged my perspective, challenged even my laziness in certain areas or my procrastination. I'll figure that out later. I'll figure that out when I get married. I'll figure that out when I become a parent. It challenged all of those areas where I didn't want to do the work of introspection. It made me uncomfortable and it set me on the right path of discomfort, enough discomfort to be able to change the status quo in what I deemed my life to be. And so we're going to speak about a point that I began to look at things from my responsibility. So there were a set of childhood traumas that literally, what's the saying? It's the straw that broke the camel's back. So these childhood traumas broke me, absolutely broke me. And I'm not talking from a dramatic standpoint. I literally mean that there were some really dark things that I saw, I was exposed to, that made me, because of my parents' profession as pastors, there were some things that I was exposed to by people, that they pastored and led, some very dark things and childhood traumas that led me on this path of not wanting to do relationships. But at around 17, 18, I began to view this thing as my responsibility. So I began to deal with those childhood traumas as my responsibility. They weren't my fault. I wasn't the aggressor in those situations. I would have been considered the victim in those scenarios. Even in that position of powerlessness, I saw it as not my fault that it happened to me, but it was my responsibility to grow out of those things. And that mindset shift took place in it was a service. I was at church, and at the time I was thinking through what had happened based on the sermon, and I was really praying to God about growing out of those situations, or getting better, not getting bitter. And as I was praying, God began to speak to me about doing counseling and about therapy. And um, I was kind of very much so against it because I wasn't used to being able to speak freely. My voice was constantly, not by my family or anything like that, but by people and relationships and things that I'd had, my voice was constantly under attack. So I was very much so voiceless and powerless in a lot of those scenarios. So I wasn't used to going to a space where they would allow me to speak freely, and I would also be able to not be shut down. I didn't know how to navigate. There's this thing called transactional analysis, and it's where you communicate or you behave as either a parent, an adult, or a child. And in a lot of my relationships, I communicated and I behaved as a parent, didn't know how to respond as an adult, didn't know how to respond as a child. And in some scenarios, because of how abusive they were, I was either the parent or the child. There was kind of not many relationships where I was in the adult space, where I was cognizant enough to make my own decisions and things like that. Very unhealthy dynamics, I would say. There were some that were great, and I could articulate as an adult, but most of those were much later on in my life and not as early on as the traumas that I'm talking about. And so in that transactional analysis phase, there was a lot I didn't know how to. There was a lot of relationships where I didn't know how to communicate and or behave or navigate the relationships as an adult. And so I remember being, I believe, 19 or 20, and saying to my leader, I need counseling. I need therapy. It's not even an option now. This is part of my responsibility to Esther Glory, to Glory. She needs counseling, she needs therapy, and it is part of her responsibility to see that through. And so, even though it was hard, even though I fought for months, even though in my beginning sessions, I remember going in there with a wall up. I'm not talking about boundaries or barriers, I'm talking about entire walls up to the sky, because I was defensive and I didn't want anyone to encroach in my personal space. And so it was my responsibility that led me to make an uncomfortable decision to go to counseling and therapy, which helped me on a growth journey, and that helped me to grow so exponentially. But that responsibility led me to make an uncomfortable decision versus me seeing the situation as my fault and it leading me to sit in it, to become bitter in it, and to drink off of it. I didn't want to become drunk off of my guilt, but rather I enjoyed when it wasn't easy. Let me say that now. It wasn't easy, but I enjoyed when I saw something as my responsibility and the kind of person it made me to pursue growth in that area and to pursue that feeling of discomfort and to pursue the change that I was after. And so what I want to encourage you guys through this episode is the things that you see as your fault. I want to pray even today that God would begin to deal with your mindset and your capacity and your perspective and understanding that it may not have been your fault. And even if it is your fault, it's still your responsibility. And if it wasn't your fault, it still is your responsibility. Your responsibility in it is non-negotiable, but choose growth. Choose the level, choose the path unknown, choose the discomfort. Don't just choose what you're used to. Choose the uncertain path and follow God's voice. For his sheep know his voice and they follow him. So choose the uncomfortable path. Choose the path where you can hear his voice leading you to and challenging you and stretching you in a journey of growth. Choose that path. I can tell you for sure I'm still on that path, but it is a path that produces fruit. I can only tell you from results, guys. This podcast is a fruit of that. Everything you see me doing is a fruit of that. Even the things that are to come are a fruit of that. And so please make sure that you choose the path unknown and follow the voice of God. Next season, we'll be talking about hearing God's voice. We're going to talk about it all: dreams, visions, the audible voice of God, pictures, impressions, knowings, the peace of God as a leading and as a guide. We're going to speak about it all, but choose the path where you hear the voice of God telling you to go the most. And that path is usually developed and grown and stretched and challenged when your mindset shifts that this may not have been my fault, and even if it is, it still is my responsibility. And so that's this week's episode, fault versus responsibility. I really hope and pray that this has encouraged and blessed you guys. And if you've chosen the path of responsibility, I want to journey with you. So let me know how this is going for you. And also, there's an amazing book by a Christian leader. It's called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Cesaro. And it is a book recommendation that I could not stand behind any more than I already do. I have recommended this book to so many different people, and they have all said how they've been blessed, absolutely blessed by it. And it's on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description details of the podcast. And so please make sure that you have a look and you go and grab the book for yourself. It's called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Cesaro. It is a phenomenal book that will aid you on this journey of emotional and mental health while being a believer. And so remember, guys, we are hearing God's voice until we become who he's ordained for us to become, and then we begin to do all he has ordained for us to do. I absolutely love you guys. I'm going to leave you with the Recalibrate challenge of the week for this week. If you weren't at the masterclass, or even if you were and you just want to support what we're doing, make sure that you go to the podcast details and you grab yourself the full experience of the masterclass for 2021 before we have our next one in March to celebrate our 1-year anniversary. And please make sure that you grab this book by Peter Cesaro, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. That's your challenge for this week. I absolutely love you guys. I adore you. Please make sure that you head on over to the website, grab everything you need to, and have a look in the podcast details so that you can get all the information that you need. Have an amazing week, guys. I love you. Peace and love.